All right, I want to talk specifically about Jewish law, which is known as Halakhah. Judaism is more than a system of beliefs. It is a way of life that embraces the sacred and the secular. Really, there is no secular in Judaism. Everything is sacred. And what you do, as determined by the law, is what it means to be a Jew. The sources of this teaching, the source of this teaching is the Torah, literally teaching. And this term is sometimes used to refer to the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But it really can mean the whole Bible, that and the Talmud, and all the oral Torah of Rabbinic Judaism, the interpretation of the written. It's a flexible term, but strictly it means the 5 books of Moses. Halakhah is an action verb. It means to go, to walk, because it's something you do. It's the legal component of Rabbinic Jewish tradition. It addresses all aspects of Jewish life. Orthodox Jews see Halakhah as or possibly the key element of Rabbinic Judaism. Other groups have lessened its importance or even disregarded its importance. Rabbinic Judaism divides all Jewish tradition into 2 categories: Halakhah, the law, and Agadah. Agadah is an Aramaic word. It means tales, lore. And Agadah is essentially everything that is not Halakhah. It includes folklore, stories, wisdom, tales of the sages, that kind of thing. Now, the basis for Halakhah is assumed to be the Bible, specifically the books of Moses, the Pentateuch. And there are in those books 613 mitzvot. Mitzvot is plural for commandments. A single one is a mitzvah, a commandment. And there are 613 given in the Torah to Moses. They are instructions. There are 365 negative ones, don't do this, and 248 positive ones, do this. They were first compiled into this list, sort of crossing out duplicates, that sort of thing, and coming up with a list of exactly 613 by Moses Maimonides himself. This is another reason that Moses Maimonides in medieval Judaism is really probably the most important Jew after Moses himself. So what's an example of a mitzvah? Well, there are the obvious ones. The 10 Commandments are in the 613, but one example is the source of something called the mezuzah. It's a little tiny box that you put on your doorpost. All Jews have one, and it's found, it's based on Deuteronomy, and this is also the source of the Shema, that important statement of Jewish belief. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your heads and bind them on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. That's the source of Tefillin. And then finally, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And, Jews could assume that that's just figurative. It's saying, hey, really own this. But no, they take it literally, and they've created the mezuzah. It's a tiny box with a little scroll with the Shema written on it, and it's customary to touch or kiss the mezuzah when you leave and when you return home. It's also a rabbinic Jewish custom to kiss your husband or wife when you leave and return. That seems like a common Western tradition, but it actually is a Jewish idea. So to reiterate, the commandments, the law, come from the Torah. The Torah comes from God. God gives the Torah, this revelation, to Moses at Sinai. And then it's taken up by Joshua, the prophets, then the great assembly. The forerunner of the rabbis are responsible for the Torah. This is admittedly a complicated chain of interpretation. Jews acknowledge this, but nevertheless link the divine revelation to the oral teaching. They emphasize there is no new revelation. The Torah is it. We're not going to get any more revelation from God. This is obviously a response to Christianity and to Islam. The New Testament and Quran are very fine things, but they are not divine revelation. The Torah is all there is. And after Moses, Halakhah is therefore essentially a human endeavor. People using their reason to figure out what God meant in the Torah and applying that to modern circumstances. This is why Jews argue and talk a lot. They've got to suss out what the law is based on the Torah. So the Halakhah and the evolution of rabbinic Jewish thought is due to unforeseen events and unexpected hardships, and it has a very clear evolutionary trail. The first systematic compilation of Halakhah was the Mishnah. This was completed about 220 CE. This was the work of Judah the Prince, you may recall him, working in Galilee. And this was the first attempt to kind of organize the law. This further evolved into the two Talmuds. The Palestinian Talmud in the late 4th century and the Babylonian Talmud completed 500 to 600. The Babylonian Talmud, you'll recall, is bigger and generally considered more important and more influential. The Talmud is a mix of the Mishnah plus all the tales and so forth that form the Midrash. It's a huge compilation. And the Talmud were not yet completely systemized codes of law. They were wildly tangential discussions that read like a Supreme Court judicial opinion, but would have these tangents off with stories about this particular sage and this funny anecdote. And it also contained the dissenting opinions as well. It was voluminous. Now, an attempt to sort of corral all of this, the first significant one, occurred in the Middle Ages, and we find Halakhah carefully codified by, of course, Moses Maimonides. He created something called the Mishnah Torah, and it was 14 books of law, and it left nothing out, even the laws around animal sacrifices. Now think about that. He's writing this in the 1100s. There has not been a temple for 1,000 years, but hey, we think there's going to be one again someday, and he's including the laws governing animal sacrifices in the Mishnah Torah. All right, the next big, streamlining, codification of the law was a book called the Arba'a Turim, which means, in Hebrew, the 4 rows. And it's just sometimes referred to as the Turim or the Tur. The 4 rows is an allusion to the high priest breastplate pictured here. There's a mock-up pictured here. The breastplate of the high priest of the temple had 4 rows of precious stones. How do we know this? Well, because the Bible, when it talks about the instructions to build the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, it says very clearly exactly what the priest's vestments, what their clothes should look like. It's also a reference to the fact that the author of this book, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher in Germany, has organized the law into 4 convenient categories: prayer and festivals, dietary laws, family law, and civil law. And this book was published and printed in Italy in 1475. This is right after printing is invented, and this is the first book printed in Hebrew. I think I mentioned earlier that after printing was invented, a disproportionately large number of books printed were in Hebrew because Jews had such an insatiable appetite for books. They had an unusually high degree literacy rate, and they had the money to buy them. Finally, the next and really final important codification of the law was the Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Joseph Cairo. And he published this in 1565, and this would become the definitive work. It's called the Arranged Table because it sort of purports to lay out the laws in a systematic fashion like a beautifully arranged table setting. And it preserved the 4 categories of the Turim. Now, until the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, adherence to Halakhah was essentially synonymous with being a Jew. People who didn't follow the law were basically kind of pushed out, lost to Judaism. The Sadducees of the late First Temple period, they they were they were almost deists. They believed in the clockmaker God and didn't follow the law, and they were kind of lost to Judaism. The Karaites in the Gaonic period that kind of wanted to go back to just the Bible, forget the Talmud and all the other stuff, and go back, sort of like Jewish Protestants, go back to the original. They were kind of pushed out as well. So if you were a Jew, you followed the law. Now, we could go into detail about what the law is, but it's so legalistic and so convoluted, we're not going to. I'm going to look just at two examples. Examples from mitzvot about the Sabbath and about diet, kosher eating. Many seem irrational and even have clear workarounds, clever workarounds. The Sabbath, for example, you cannot carry money. You cannot use a light switch. You cannot carry anything outside the home. Now, but what if you want to carry your baby to grandma's house for a dinner, or push your aged grandfather to the same place in a wheelchair? I'm using Stephen Prothero's examples here from his book, God Is Not One. Well, guess what? There's a workaround, something called an Eruv, E-R-U-V. It's a literal wire set up by rabbis and blessed with some mojo or whatever. And within that area, he calls it a magic schlepping circle. Within that area, you can carry stuff outside the home. It sort of magically makes everything a home. And since 2007, much of Manhattan is surrounded by an Eruv. Here's a picture of it from a Jewish Center website, so you can know where you can, how you can follow the law and still get away with carrying something. Kosher laws seem really strict and complex. Christians don't really have many food taboos, but Muslims do. They have something called halal, which is kind of like kosher. Hindus, of course, have elaborate standards, but Jews top them all. You can only consume fish with scales and fins, therefore catfish is out. No shellfish, no pork. Now, anthropologists like to look at food taboos and think of why they might exist. Well, ancient Jews and Muslims were nomads in the desert, and goats and sheep were convenient animals to herd along with you. Pigs, not so much. So this is somewhat logical. But then there are laws like don't mix dairy and meat, which seems not quite so clear. And that requires keeping 2 sets of flatware and 2 sets of plates. So it can get really, really complicated. But some of these laws seem just completely inexplicable. For example, Jewish priests have to avoid contact with the dead. Why is that? Which brings up an important point. There are, if a priest, defiled by contact with the dead, should defile the temple, there's a clear way to purify him. It's in the Bible. And this is an example of one of these really inexplicable laws, and it's the red heifer example, and it's so weird that these laws are referred to by Jews themselves as red heifer laws. It says you've got to get a red heifer, a perfectly red heifer. It's got to be at least 3 years old, and when I say red heifer, I mean not one hair of another color. And according to tradition, there have been only 8 of these in existence, and there's a magically professed 9th. And this is important. This has apocalyptic connotations because we can't build a third temple until we purify the site with the sacrifice of a red heifer. So when a red heifer appears, that means we can build the third temple. That means the Messiah can come. And so you have this odd alliance of ultra-fundamentalist Christians and ultra-Orthodox Jews trying to literally breed a red heifer. The ultra-Orthodox Jews are doing it to bring the Messiah and the third temple. The Christians are doing it because they think that that Messiah will be the Antichrist, and this will presage the apocalypse. So these laws, these red heifer laws, are referred to as chukim, red heifer commandments. They're irrational commandments. And the idea, and so why do we have these laws? And Rabbinic Judaism has several reasons. Number one, they're not unreasonable. Maybe we just don't know the reason. I mean, God knows the reason, we don't. Hence, they're not irrational but as Moses Maimonides said, they're supra-rational. They're beyond reason. They're not without reason, they're beyond reason. Ancient Jews didn't know that pork's can give you trichinosis. They didn't have all the information. We know now that pork is bad for your heart. Maybe there are other things we don't know. So maybe we just don't know everything. Two, they are chukim, or God's way of allowing us to express confidence in His wisdom. If we know the full reason, then maybe we're relying too much on our reason and not enough on God. And third, maybe it's a way to just teach us self-discipline, to say no. God creates bacon, and it is delicious, and then says, don't eat this. Why would He do that? Maybe to strengthen our will, to be disciplined. By the way, there's a Jewish private high school in Massachusetts, Gann Academy, whose mascot is the red heifer. That's why I've showed this picture. But one last word about these, why do Jews have these crazy laws? I'm going to read a paragraph from your reading from Prothero's book. It says, when I was last in Jerusalem, a Jewish friend showed me around the city. On 2 different days, I offered to buy him ice cream. In each case, because of the dietary requirement not to mix meat and dairy, he had to recollect when he had last eaten meat. His community's rule was a 3-hour wait. This may seem irrational, but for him, my offer appeared to engender Buddhist-style mindfulness, prompting him to be mindful of what he was thinking about eating and of what he had eaten in the past and when. And more important, they prompted him to be mindful of God. That, I think, is, in a nutshell, what Halakhah is about. Now, with the Enlightenment and the emancipation of Jews, came Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment of Moses Mendelssohn, you'll recall, in Germany. Jews could enter mainstream society. And the Maskilim, the followers of Haskalah, they considered themselves the heirs of Maimonides. They said, look, we're just trying to reconcile 2 ways of thought, the rational and the spiritual. Halakhah underwent an assault. Haskalah led to Reform Judaism in Germany, which meant maintaining Jewish identity while accepting the norms of mainstream society, and therefore letting go of Halakhah and the restrictive laws. They would say, how can Jews be a light to all the nations if Halakhah is a barrier between Jews and Gentiles? Modern biblical scholarship, beginning in the late 19th century, also began to take a toll on Halakhah as well. Questions about the authorship of the Torah began to make cracks in its divine authority. And so today we have this great division among Jews, and it's based on adherence to Halakhah. Reform Jews don't follow it all. Conservative Jews to some degree. Orthodox Jews to a much greater degree, although, as you know, there are divisions within Orthodox Judaism. So even though all Jews don't still practice Halakhah, it is still a central defining characteristic of Jews and groups of Jews.